Welcome back to The Explainer. In Part 1, we saw how the Weimar Republic crumbled and how Hitler clawed his way to the top. Today, in Part 2, we're going to get into something much darker. We're going to dissect how the Nazi Party took an idea, an ideology, and turned it into a terrifying machine of total control and mass murder.
You've probably heard this quote before, from Pastor Martin Niemöller. It just perfectly captures that creeping horror we're about to explore, how a whole society can just fall into silence and, complicity, while freedom is torn apart piece by piece. It's such a powerful warning, right? That when you target one group, you're really opening the door to persecuting everyone.
Okay, so here's what we've got on deck today. We'll do a super quick recap of the path to power. Then, we'll dig into the blueprint for their so-called racial state. We'll look at the 3 horrifying steps to annihilation, how they forged the ideal Nazi citizen, the architecture of hate that held it all together, and finally, we'll talk about silence, witness, and memory.
All right, first up, a quick recap on the path to power. And as a refresher from Part 1, you'll remember Hitler's rise wasn't some overnight thing. No way. It was really fueled by the ashes of World War I, the total economic chaos of the Great Depression, and just how fragile Germany's first democracy, the Weimar Republic, really was.
And this timeline, it just shows you how breathtakingly fast it all happened. Democracy was just dismantled. After all those years of instability, Hitler gets appointed chancellor in January 1933. 1 month later, just 1 month, the Reichstag fire happens, and that becomes the perfect excuse to suspend all civil liberties. And then a month after that, boom, the Enabling Act. That's it. Hitler has dictatorial power, and the stage is set for everything that's about to come.
Okay, so let's get into the blueprint for their racial state. We need to look at the core belief system that was really driving this whole machine, because this wasn't just about politics or grabbing land, it was a truly terrifying worldview, and it was all rooted in a completely twisted version of science.
So the whole Nazi worldview was built on this one chillingly simple idea, a totally warped take on survival of the fittest. They cooked up this whole racial hierarchy, right, with the so-called Nordic German Aryans at the very top. For them, all of human history was just one big struggle for racial purity and dominance. And the terrifying part is, this wasn't some fringe idea. This dangerous pseudoscience became the absolute central pillar of state policy.
And their ultimate goal? To create a pure German racial community. And that meant physically eliminating anyone they considered undesirable. Just look at this list. Obviously, Jews were the primary target, but it also included Roma, black people, Slavs, and this is the part that's so shocking, even Germans themselves. If you had a physical or mental disability, you were on this list. Under things like the euthanasia program, tens of thousands of Germans were murdered by their own government, the very state that was supposed to protect them.
Which brings us to the 3 steps to annihilation. You see, the persecution of European Jews wasn't just a bunch of random violent acts. No, it was a systematic, totally calculated process that got worse and worse over time. And understanding these stages is so important because it shows you that genocide isn't just one thing that happens. It's a planned, executed descent into absolute horror.
Wow, just look at the progression there. You have no right to live among us as citizens. Then it becomes, you have no right to live among us. And finally, you have no right to live. It's a journey from social death to actual physical death. The language itself tells you everything. So let's break down each one of these horrifying stages.
So stage 1, exclusion. The whole point here was to legally and socially just erase Jewish people from German life. You have the Nuremberg laws, which basically strip them of their citizenship. Overnight, they became non-persons in the only country they'd ever known. They were kicked out of their jobs, their businesses were boycotted, their property was stolen. All of it was designed to isolate them, to make life impossible, to pressure them to just leave.
And then came stage 2, ghettoization. So, after they were stripped of all their rights, the next step was to physically remove them from society. They were forced to wear that yellow star to mark them out. Then they were herded into these walled-off sections of cities, basically open-air prisons. And we have to be clear, these ghettos weren't just holding pens. They were intentionally designed to kill people through starvation, through overcrowding, through disease.
And that leads to stage 3, annihilation. This was it, the final monstrous step.
The goal wasn't just segregation anymore. It became systematic, industrial-scale murder. The ghettos were emptied out and people were packed into goods trains, cattle cars, and shipped to these death factories like Auschwitz and Treblinka. Places built for one single horrific purpose: mass extermination.
So you have to ask yourself, how? How did the regime get so many people to either support this or, at the very least, just accept it? Well, it was no accident. They were forging the perfect Nazi citizen. And they started by systematically taking control of the minds of the youngest generation.
The entire education system was hijacked to create the next generation of Nazis. First, they cleansed the schools of any Jewish teachers or students. Then they rewrote all the textbooks. They literally invented subjects like racial science to try and justify their hateful ideas. Even sports, like boxing, were pushed to make kids more aggressive. It was total indoctrination. From the time they were little kids in the Jungvolk to the Hitler Youth, they were taught one thing: be loyal to Hitler and hate the enemies of the state. It was about creating a generation loyal only to the party.
So you hear this quote from Hitler: "In my state, the mother is the most important citizen." And you might think, okay, but yeah, there was a huge sinister catch. A woman's value in Nazi Germany was tied directly to her biology, specifically her ability to produce what they considered racially desirable children for the Reich.
They weren't seen as equal citizens at all. They were basically instruments of racial policy. If you were a so-called desirable mother and had a bunch of Aryan kids, you were celebrated. You got medals: bronze for 4, silver for 6, gold for 8. You got special treatment in shops, on buses. But if you were a deviant woman, someone who didn't conform, who maybe had contact with a Jewish person, you were brutally punished. Publicly shamed, head shaved, paraded through the streets. You were a traitor.
Which brings us to the architecture of hate. So how did they hold this whole system of control and terror together? What was the glue? Well, the answer is a constant, inescapable, and very, very carefully crafted stream of propaganda.
And this is where it gets really chilling. Look at how they weaponize language itself. In all their official documents, you almost never see the words kill or murder. Instead, they came up with this whole bureaucratic vocabulary. Mass murder became the final solution or special treatment. Deportation to gas chambers was called evacuation. The gas chambers themselves, disinfection areas. It made the entire machinery of death sound sterile, routine, almost boring. And their propaganda was incredibly sophisticated. It was tailored to hit every single part of the population. For the peasants, they promised to save them from capitalism. For the workers, they positioned Hitler as a fellow frontline soldier. It was all about appealing to the specific fears and hopes of each group. But the one constant, they always relentlessly stoked hatred against a common, completely fabricated enemy, the Jewish people.
Okay, so let's talk about silence, witness, and memory. When you're faced with this kind of total control, this constant barrage of propaganda, and the very real threat of terror, how do ordinary people react? What do you do?
Well, if you look at the population, it really breaks down into 3 groups. You had a small core of true believers, a lot of them the product of that youth indoctrination we just talked about. Then you had an even smaller, incredibly brave group of active resistors. But the largest slice, by far, the passive onlookers, the witnesses, the people who were swayed by propaganda, paralyzed by fear, and ultimately chose to look away and stay silent.
And this slide just shows you the 2 completely different worlds that existed in the very same country at the very same time. On one hand, you have someone like Erna Kranch, a German woman who remembered it as a good time. She liked it. And on the other hand, you have the Jewish experience, a living nightmare so terrifying it invaded their dreams. As the book says, they died many deaths even before they reached the gas chamber. It's a crucial point. Your reality was completely, 100% dependent on who you were.
So after the war, how did the world learn the full horror? It's because of the survivors, people who went through the unimaginable and were driven by this incredible spirit to bear witness. They kept diaries, they hid archives, some of them were famously found buried in milk cans in the Warsaw Ghetto. After they were freed, they told their stories. They made sure the truth would not be forgotten, that it wouldn't be destroyed along with so many millions of victims.
Which leaves us with this question. When history is being written, what is the cost of looking away? Because the history of the Nazi regime isn't just a story about the past. It's a tribute to the few who resisted, it's a condemnation of those who collaborated, and maybe most importantly,
It is a permanent, chilling warning to all of us about the true cost of just watching in silence.